Molly Wood, climate tech-focused managing director at Launch and co-host of This Week in Startups with Jason Calacanis. Welcome to the Epicumen podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so honored to be an Epicumen.
Well, you certainly fit the bill, and glad it wasn't too far of a trip from you being here in Berkeley from Oakland.
Didn't even have to cross a bridge. Yeah. I could do this every day.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. By the way, also thank you for having me on your podcast, This Week in Climate Startups. Enjoyed that. I've been getting a lot of inbound from entrepreneurs and people I haven't talked to in a long time saying, "Oh, I saw you on Molly's podcast." And so I thought it was only fitting that we could return the favor here.
That's great. I love it. It seems like it's becoming sort of a new VC thing too, the podcast swap.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, why don't it'd be good to share with the audience a little bit more about Launch and particularly around your focus on climate. And then maybe This Week in Startups as well.
Yeah, great. Yes. I like to tell people that I have 2 full-time jobs, but I find that now that I'm in a world that involves a lot of founders, startup founders, no one is sympathetic to that, which is very fair. So I came to Launch in January after a 20-plus something career as a tech and business journalist. Launch is an early stage technology VC fund, and we have a couple of educational programs. So we have the Founders University for very, very early stage entrepreneurs, the ones I like to call PowerPoint and a Dream. And we invest $25,000 in some of the companies that come out of that 14-week cohort. We have an accelerator that I think is probably best known. That's maybe Launch's best known product is this accelerator that's similar to Y Combinator. It's a $100,000 investment and it's 12 weeks, but it's very small cohorts, super artisanal, hands-on product, 7 each per cohort. And then we have a fund, and our fund investments we make alongside our syndicate of angels. Jason's legacy, history is as an angel investor. And so we have this very large syndicate of angel investors who have been part of this kind of investment journey for about a decade. And recently we've launched some verticals. So we have a SaaS syndicate. And then since I came on in January with a focus on climate tech, which we had not had before as a firm, in April, we launched a climate syndicate. So we have angel investors who are super passionate about this space on board to invest and be a resource for our founders. And we've had a couple climate companies in the accelerator, a couple in the syndicate. It's all happening. It's amazing.
Exciting. And then you also somehow do a daily podcast?
And we do a 6-day-a-week podcast. Yep.
6 days a week.
6 days a week.
Wow.
We have a Sunday show. Yeah, it's it's two jobs. But you know what? This was the pitch. Like Jason and I went out to, he comes from media also. So I think that's part of why we resonated. I've known him for a very long time, a little over 15 years. And we had this ramen lunch and talked about this job. And he said, basically, we podcast in the morning and we invest in the afternoon. And it has worked out exactly like that, except for the occasional trip to Berkeley to podcast in the afternoon.
Right. Sometimes podcast in the afternoon.
Sometimes.
Well, good. And help us understand how you kind of interact with the. First off, how many angels are we talking? And then how do you work with them? How does that all come together?
The syndicate is fairly hands-off from the perspective of the managing directors. I mean, certainly, well, that's not true. I mean, we all have access to each other on Slack, and our syndicate members actually, unlike, I think there are a couple of syndicates that don't let their syndicate members talk to founders. Our founders and syndicate members really can interact, and hopefully the members of the syndicate can be a resource for those founders because a lot of them are subject matter experts. And they are, I don't know, sort of like friends on this journey, I guess. It's great to know that at any point I could pop into Slack and say, help, I really need some, I don't know, somebody who understands perovskite, solar technology. So they're simultaneously a resource and LPs in a way.
So you use the angel syndicate for deal sourcing, to help with due diligence occasionally, and then also to help with portfolio companies along the way, like after you've made the investment? Is that the idea?
Yeah, all of that is an option. And then there are plenty of members of the syndicate who are much more hands-off, right? They're investing partners. We send them deal memos, a couple times a month. I think we do somewhere between 2 and 4 deals a month, and they throw up a hand and say they either do or do not want to participate. So it's sort of, I think it's up to the syndicate and up to the syndicate member to determine how much they want to participate.
I see.
In the actual, and some are really active and will suggest deals to us, and some will go to for expertise. But I wouldn't say that that's the most common interaction.
I see.
Yeah.
And then just curious about this. How do you decide, like, let's say you have a certain allocation, right, with a company. How do you decide how much the fund will do versus like the syndicate will do? Like, how do you balance that?
Luckily for me, that's mostly Jason's call. He's the GP, so he just determines. And most of the time, though, the syndicate is the bulk of the allocation.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Excellent.
I think the goal really has always been to democratize the investing process as much as you can democratize something that is only available to accredited investors or qualified purchasers. But it's better than nothing.
Right. And then help me and the audience understand your kind of views on climate tech. Like, how do you view kind of Launch's perspective on investing in this category?
I would say it is evolving by the minute. As I become a climate investor and subject matter expert at the same time. I've been covering climate tech and solutions for a long time as a journalist. But now it's about sort of learning how you apply that in terms of a business model and figure out what is investable and figure out the place where we're going to feel the most comfortable as a firm. And so I think some of that is happening as we speak. I can tell you that for the most part, since I'm the managing director in charge of the climate syndicate, it's heavily influenced by what I am most passionate and currently most knowledgeable about, right? So I have a particular interest in consumer behavior because 13 years of my journalism career was spent at CNET. And so I sort of feel like I really understand consumers, but also the power that they can have when a lot of them do the same thing all at the same time. I may be like the last climate person in the world who still believes in the power of the consumer, but I do. I am a big believer in measurement. I think you can't manage what you don't measure. So I think of, well, I'll do the third one and then I'll get more into the philosophy. And then the third thing that I'm really fascinated by and think is really powerful is informed, I think, by my 6.5 years at Marketplace, which is financial tools. I actually think that there's a lot of investable opportunity in tools that financialize a part of the climate solution universe, whether that's, we had a company on This Week in Climate Startups actually that is offering a mutual fund to 401k providers that's divested from fossil fuels. So sort of a S&P 460 kind of thing. And that is a really powerful instrument. I think someone else in the climate space said to me, if you divest your portfolio of fossil fuels, that can have 30 times more impact than going vegetarian over the life of your portfolio. So those are the kinds of tools that I'm just sort of into, I think, because I got really interested in the economy and monetary policy. And turns out capitalism really works for some things.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And so we're co-investors in a company that we can't really talk about right now yet, but we will. But are there other companies in your portfolio that you want to plug or want to mention?
Yeah, definitely.
On the climate side?
I am super excited about the Climate Syndicate's other investment, Clarity Movement, which is hardware-enabled service. What do they call it? Pollution sensing as a service. So it's all about real-time, super precise measurement of air pollution, which kills 9 million people every year, and is a massive kind of side effect of and driver of climate change. And they're just doing incredible work. And it's a really interesting space because there's consumer measurements that everybody's familiar with, like purple air.
Right.
And then there's citywide monitoring. And these are these massive stations that are the size of a container on a container ship that costs $250,000 to buy and $100,000 to maintain every year. And so a city might have one or two of those. meaning not great air pollution coverage. Clarity sits in between. So they sell to the City of London is a customer, UCLA is a customer, so that they can do this much more local real-time monitoring of air pollution. And it helps, this will be relevant to you, I think, it helps solve some of the environmental injustice issues raised by the fact that pollution happens disproportionately in underrepresented communities, affects those communities much more, and the more you can make that incontrovertible with data, the more pressure there will be to fix it. So I love this company's technology, and I also love the way that they're approaching this like really serious problem. They're great.
I love it. And I will agree that, I mean, all the data shows that the most, underrepresented groups and the lowest on the economic totem pole are the ones that are already being most affected by climate change and will continue to. But just on this one, I'm really curious, and I love the space. But how do they think about business model, right? When you've got, I don't know enough about Purple Air, like where they're getting those measurements, but like, how do you think about business model with a company like that?
So they're effectively a hardware as a service model. So they have a pretty low priced set of sensors that they can put anywhere, and those sensors are adaptable to future sensing that they're not totally talking about yet. And then they sell the real-time ongoing monitoring as well as some on-the-ground tech support to cities or school districts or agencies or whoever wants to install this. I think the way they're thinking about it is that it's the caliber, it is the grade and accuracy of monitoring of a city-sized monitoring station, and it's hyper-local in a way that Purple Air can be. It can be very local, but not necessarily as accurate, whereas maybe a big monitoring station is extremely accurate, but a lot less local. They're splitting the baby there at a much more affordable price than the monitoring stations.
I see. Interesting. And let me ask you this, like as a VC investor, right? You interact with a lot of other VCs, and what would you say is your style in terms of the factors or the characteristics you look for a founder or for a company that you think are like more important to you than maybe to other investors?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, this may or may not be great for me long-term. I don't know. Because what I have found is that I approach almost all of my meetings the way that I approached an interview as a journalist, which is that I really am into the story. And we have these wide-ranging conversations. My meetings are always way longer than some of my coworkers. And I want to understand all of the future potential about the business. I get super excited about talking about, well, where could it go and who else could buy this? And then very often I discovered early on, I forget to ask really important things like, how are you going to make money and how much money do you think you might make? And, who's going to pay you and why? So I'm working on incorporating some of those. But for me, I think first and foremost, really, I'm like making a connection with the founders and I'm getting sold on their story. And I hope that works for me.
Sure.
Eventually, I do ask them how they're going to make money, clearly.
Well, the storytelling aspect.
But I'm like, just send me your spreadsheet later. Like, let's just talk.
Right. Right. The storytelling aspect is so important because I think very early in my VC career, I was more interested in the technology and like how's it different and whatnot. And but I think what I've realized is that the ability to tell a good story is such a valuable skill for a founder or CEO to have, because it's not only fundraising, which is already critically important, but telling that same story to customers, telling that same story to potential employees, it's critical. And if they are good at the fundraising, that de-risks the company dramatically. So I hear that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your specifically like what you gained or what skills you picked up from media, right? That you think you've applied to venture, and how that's helped you.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there are ways in which it's a one-to-one transfer, where it's just There are times in meetings where I feel like nothing has changed about my job because it's just have a really interesting conversation with someone who's building something cool and then be appropriately skeptical. And I would say if there's like a single thing that has been the most valuable, it's that I think the key to being a good journalist is being willing to just be a dum-dum on behalf of the audience, to ask a question that might be really stupid. And to do that because you know that someone is out there who isn't going to understand what you're talking about, that there might be a lot of jargon or there might be complicated concepts or somebody's talking really fast, and that it's your job on behalf of your audience to step in and say, hey, I don't understand this at all. Like, I don't understand a single word you just said. Please explain it to me like I'm 5, and then maybe do it again. And there's this fascinating story about this Fortune reporter, Bethany. I'll look it up later and get back to you. But she went to an Enron earnings report, earnings press conference, and she sort of kept asking over and over, like, "Hey, how do you?" And this was right at the time of Enron's peak, of course, the big energy company that collapsed, and it was a big scandal for people listening who are not as old as I am. And she was saying, okay, there's just one more thing that I don't totally understand, though. I just have one more quick question. How do you make money? Right? And she was bold enough to be the only person in the room to say, I don't understand how you make money. And the answer to that question was so vague and wandering and illuminating that she started going around asking all these other people, like, hey, do you know how Enron makes money? And it turned out no one did. And she wrote this big cover story for Fortune. This is like legendary in journalism world in 2000 that really started the downfall of this company. So what I find is that the more I can do that, and actually as part of our Founders University and the Accelerator, I do a course for our founders on narrative building and narrative development for investing, hiring, and storytelling, because you need your narrative, like we just said, for all of those things. And a huge part of that is that if I am saying to you, how do you make money? What is your business? What is your business model? What is your product? I can't believe how many founders I meet with who can't totally tell me what their product is. And so the ability, the willingness to just look like an idiot in a room, I think is probably the most valuable thing that I brought from journalism.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like, first off, I've been known to tell people my job is to ask dumb questions. Like,
totally.
It's like, and I think it's true. And I also think that, we are lucky in that we get to interact with these brilliant people all the time, right? And they can be brilliant on a number of different dimensions, right? But I feel like we've probably both gotten to the point where it's if this brilliant person, clearly brilliant, is trying to explain something to us and we don't understand it, it's like, well, then there's an issue with
right.
the storytelling or the way it's being communicated. And I suspect that your ability as a journalist to like ask those like probing, like skeptical questions of like, well, how does that really work? Right? Because wouldn't this also be true or something like that would come in handy? Because that's how I feel like I am getting to it. But it's tricky because you also have to be building a good relationship at the same time.
Yep. Yeah. It's very reportery in those ways where you're making a friend, but you're also restating is very helpful, So wait, do I understand this correctly? So you make a sensor and then the sensor costs this much and then the service around the sensor costs this much and then how long do they pay for that? And you're kind of, it's a very interesting dance. And I don't want this to be mistaken for I want a great storyteller as a founder, right? There's a difference. I'm not arguing for more Adam Newmans when I say that I'm interested in someone's story and their narrative. And in fact, sometimes the more awkward and unpolished someone is, the better their story is, if that makes sense. I mean, I'm really talking about real stories, not the like BS super slick kind.
Right. That is important nuance. I think the other thing I think about on this topic is, again, not necessarily how smooth the story is, but when I get to my 20th question that I've asked, right? If the founder has thought about it, right? It's like, oh yeah, I thought about that. Great question. Thought about that. Here's my current thinking on it. Not necessarily that they have the answer, but I do like to see that kind of like wide library of thinking that has already been done that proves like, okay, I'm all in this. This is what I think about 24/7, 365, for the last few years. And this is all I want to do.
Yep.
Yeah.
My first founder, who will always be my most precious, is just wrapping up our accelerator, Anukampa Freedom Gupta Faner. And she's got this company that does zero waste grocery delivery. Eat Spring is the company. And that, obviously she came into the accelerator into this big headwind of zero grocery, which was doing a similar thing in the Bay Area, shutting down. And it's an operationally difficult business, grocery delivery, no matter what. And then what they're doing is sourcing hyperlocal goods from wholesalers, packaging them in glass or stainless steel containers that they've actually, in some cases, fabricated themselves, like berry containers that don't smash things. And they deliver it to you in EVs once a week. And then you have this beautiful Instagrammable pantry. And then you give it all back and get new groceries. And it's one of those businesses that, one, I want to exist more than anything. And everyone I know is like, I would pay so much for that. So let's go Freedom. She goes by Freedom. And but on top of that, she is that founder. She did a TED Talk on the little coffee sleeves. She kind of popularized the idea of how important it is to recycle them. She lives a zero waste life with her husband. There aren't even any trash cans in their house. And I have never met she's an Indian immigrant. And she's like, I grew up in India and I could not believe when I got to America how much stuff we throw away and how absurdly wasteful this society is, and just is like a woman on a mission. And she knows everything about cutting excess waste out of your life. I've not, like, if anyone is going to make this business succeed, it is going to be this living son of a human who knows everything. I mean, you could ask her 20 million questions and she would have the answer.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It sounds exactly like what I was thinking. Oh, I did want to ask you one more question about how about the recent news that New York State is following California in eliminating fossil fuel driven cars?
I mean, how amazing is this moment?
This is incredible.
Like there have been setbacks, around energy lately, but this moment is incredible. And every time that happens, markets are born, This is where I realized I went hard from public radio into venture capitalist. But you see things like that happen and you realize that everything about procurement just changed. Everything about charging just got supercharged. I didn't want to make that pun, but I couldn't come up with another word. It's phenomenal. It's a phenomenal moment.
It's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nice to see the first domino fall and now the second domino fall, because other states are taking a look and saying, well, why wouldn't we do that? And would that help us get more manufacturing in our state? So on and so forth.
Yeah. It really is incredible. That and the investment, what are we calling it? The Inflation Reduction Act, or as I like to call it, the climate bill. But the IRA and actually the infrastructure bill that passed, that everybody forgot about, both have a ton of incredible incentives in there that just, again, allow companies to be born and thrive and solutions to exist that maybe wouldn't have had a chance before. It's actually an exciting time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that legislation is like the biggest boon to climate tech investing, whether from a VC perspective or beyond, in history, period.
Now, do you think we're recession-proof, climate tech investing?
Restate that question. What do you mean?
So if there is a broader downturn in venture funding as a result of economic recession, I sort of feel like climate tech investing could be recession resistant. Proof is a strong word, but it's not a problem that's going away.
Right. I feel that I draw from the context that I've had, over the last 10 years of climate tech investing, and where we are today is light years from where we were 10 years ago from climate tech investing. And I feel like, so it's kind of like we went from 1 to 100, and whether or not we end up being at 90 or 110, it's the difference is just so staggering. We've made so much progress that it's de minimis. I've also, the way I've thought about it is climate tech investing, it's like it didn't get to the highs of the high during like the 2020 and 2021 in terms of valuations. And nor do I think it's going to get to the lows of the low like now when there's other types of companies that are taking a real hit. Mm-hmm. So I do think we are, resistant to that. And plus there's just been so much money raised at the growth stages for climate tech that money's earmarked. It's got to go into something. Yeah. And so I'm not too worried about it either.
Great. Agree.
Agree to agree. Let me ask you a little bit about you. And so as I understand it, you grew up in a unique place in the United States, both Montana and North Dakota. But maybe you could just walk us through your upbringing and kind of how that's kind of influenced you.
This is the awkward part where I have to talk about myself and it feels so weird, but I will try. I did grow up almost exactly equally in Montana and North Dakota. So I lived 0 to 10 in Montana, and then we moved to North Dakota when I was 10, and I went to middle school and high school, so through 18, and then I went back to Montana for college, and I have a parent still in each state. So it is this very strange, I'm a Gemini. I'm like, I guess this is always how it was going to be, just duality everywhere. And I 100%, although I moved away after college and I ended up in Oakland by 99, so I've lived here now more than twice as long as I lived in either of those places, because I still have family there and I'm back there a lot. It's kind of one of those things where as you get older, you think a lot more about what made you who you are. And so I think as much as I thought I had left those states, it is only after sort of growing up all over again in the Bay Area that I realized how much I'm influenced by it. I mean, we did not have any money at all. And my sort of family history is like farmers. And so what I find is that I have this and then Montana, when I was growing up there, it's a lot more conservative now than it was. It was always a very libertarian state. I was actually telling my son today that Montana was like, we had it written into the state constitution that if the federal government had ever lifted the speed limit, the federal speed limit, that Montana would immediately revert to no speed limit, because they considered the speed limit and even seatbelt laws to be such extreme government overreach that they wrote it into the state constitution that should those things ever go away and the boot of tyranny be lifted off the state's neck, that by God you could drive as fast as you want. And so I graduated college. My first job out of college was with the Associated Press. And my first posting, they're kind of like the Army. They just sort of move you places. So I started in Helena, Montana, where I was born. And one of my jobs as a baby cub AP reporter was to every night at 11 o'clock call the sheriff and find out the highway deaths for that day and report them. That was because the AP sort of, it's a wire service. We did like lottery numbers and fatalities. And so I would call and get the fatality count, and it would be, one person from Montana and 11 people from some other state who had just come into Montana because the federal speed limit was lifted. And for a number of years, Montana had no speed limit. And
I didn't even know that.
Oh, yeah. It was crazy. So this is the late 90s. So people would just roll into Montana like it was the Audubon, hit a moose, drive off the highway, just getting killed left and right. I don't mean to be insensitive, but like,
oh my God.
If you hit a moose, you aren't going to die.
Yeah.
They're very big. So they eventually had to put then they had this rule that they called reasonable and prudent, which was if it's like sunny out and the roads are dry, then, kind of make your own call. But if the highway patrol doesn't think it's reasonable and prudent, they might pull you over. Finally, they put an actual speed limit in effect, but it was like 75. So I'm a freaking cowgirl, Joe. Like, I don't like to be told what to do. I have this sort of instant temper. And I really think that some of that is just this like Montana libertarian thing. And then the North Dakota part is just like, I grew up in a red state.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a pragmatism in there that was really informed by that childhood. Now, granted, my mom used to joke that she was one of 50 liberals in the state. She ran for the state Senate as a Democrat. So she worked with runaway and homeless youth. I mean, certainly my upbringing was not red state at home.
Right.
Let's say.
And that must have been quite a transition moving to Oakland.
Yeah, although I had gone to a 4-year liberal arts school. And again, I was raised, my mom did this work with runaway and homeless youth. And at some point in high school, after I think getting into a little trouble myself, I sort of started working with her. I did HIV/AIDS education on Native American reservations all throughout high school. And in college, I worked at a shelter for abused and neglected children. We traveled a lot. Like, she took us to DC to conferences all the time. So I didn't feel like Oakland was a super dramatic shift. I think I had a lot of window growing up into the hard realities of life. It was a bigger city. And my truck did get stolen on my second day here with all my stuff in it.
Oh, no.
So that was
that
was a real welcome to Oakland moment. Exactly. Okay.
That's wild. Yeah, no, I do. Weirdly, I do identify with that, like, don't like being told what to do thing, even though I grew up in New York and Connecticut. And I didn't, but I never felt it until I moved to Canada. And they just have a little bit of a different vibe. Like, they don't value individual freedoms as much. Like, so for example, my landlord would go through my mail because and I was like, why are you touching my mail? And he was like, well, if there's ads or things like that or flyers, like, I just get rid of them, and it's just what I do. I was kind of like, okay, but it's my mail. And then he went through my trash to make sure that I was recycling properly. And I'm like, why are you touching my trash? Like, that is mine. Like, and it was just, but the philosophy was totally different, because it was like, well, this is better for everyone, and this is just, as a community, we don't want the wrong things getting into the wrong recycling bin. And I was like, whew, I didn't know how American I was until
somebody was up in your freedom.
Yeah.
I feel like I actually just need to check myself here, because my feelings about Canada are so strong that I could get in a lot of trouble.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask you about something controversial.
I'm 100% with you. Yeah, exactly. And that controversial thing is going to be like, I hate Canada.
What spurs that for you? I mean, Montana is on the border of Canada.
I know, and North Dakota is also very Canada, and so it could be a little bit influenced by that. I will tell you this story that illustrates it.
Okay.
Without going, won't get too personal. It's just, here's what happened.
And by the way, we love Canadians. We like Canadians.
Canadians are lovely. Everyone thinks they're nice, but it's really just passive aggressive.
Oh, I can't wait to hear the story.
I went to Vancouver for a video shoot. So I was with CNET, and CBS bought CNET about, 7 or 8 years into my time working there. And so they sent us to Vancouver with a video crew to do a shoot on the set of a show, a CBS show that they were taping up there. And because it was like techie. Go talk about the technology of the CBS show. It was, some advertorial. So we get to Vancouver, which I'm told that people love.
That's right. That's where I live, by the way.
Oh.
Vancouver.
Okay.
For 3 years.
Well, I cannot wait to get to the traffic part of this story. Okay. So it was just it was a whole Canada experience at first, right? They impounded our gear because we didn't have the right permits, and we were like, we're a news crew, and it took a really long time. We sort of had to maybe bribe some people a little bit to get it. They were just like, oh, there's this fee, and then a whole bunch of papers that go along with the fee, and then somebody will eventually be back from lunch to give you your stuff. And all that. So we're driving through Vancouver to get to our shoot location, and there is not, you're probably familiar, there's not, to my knowledge, a road or highway that goes through or around the city
Correct.
in any efficient fashion.
No, zero.
Yeah. So one, what is that? Why? And then two, I pull over on the side of the road because I'm like, there is no way I'm doing this correctly. There's no way. There's not a road that just goes from point A to point B. And there's all these like speed bumps. And I'm thinking I am in the wrong location here. So I pull over to look at Google Maps on my phone and see where I am. And I look back, I look up in my rearview mirror and there's this huge white truck behind me. And I'm like, it's the Mounties. You've got to be kidding me. But it's not the Mounties. It is, in fact, the first in a line of many cars that, seeing me pulled over on the shoulder, because there wasn't really like a big shoulder, evidently assumed that there was some kind of obstacle. And so they queued up behind me like a bunch of Canadian sheep with nowhere to be. And I was like, you know what? This country has nothing but time. And I am too type A for it.
Yes.
I would have said that I was a happy type B or type B plus before I got to Canada. And then I realized, like, no,
There
I'm
you
the
go.
worst.
There you go. Exactly. It's like you see yourself in one lens, right? And then you go to a new place and you're like, oh, wow, I'm really this kind of person. So the backstory is that, this is my understanding or what I was told, is that Vancouver purposefully like voted against any sort of like major highway because they didn't want the city to become like a commuting city where like other people, where people like live outside of it and then they just drive into work. They wanted people to like live and work there. Again, it's like you can kind of see that logic. But then they suffered from this other problem, which maybe you know of, is that because of where Vancouver is situated in the world, and because of their historic, I don't know what it's like now, but historic immigration policy, basically what you had is a lot of wealth from Asia that would come over and either live there or just buy property. So the famous quote that I heard was that in Vancouver, 30% of the downtown apartments were owned and unoccupied.
Wow.
Right? So it's just like someone saying, oh, I'm going to buy that condo.
Yep.
I'm not going to live in it. I'm not going to rent it out. I'm not going to bother. I'm just like holding it because I know it's going to go up in value. And that's why the real estate prices in Vancouver are astronomical, especially like objectively, but then especially relative to the living you can make in Vancouver, right? Because there's not a ton of industry there.
Wow.
Right? So unlike the Bay Area where it's like the cost of living is high, but also there's all this
The
opportunity.
tech salaries are pretty high, right?
So it created this really challenging situation for a lot of people that I knew had grown up in Vancouver who said like, wow, I grew up here, but I can't live here anymore, right?
And I can't live outside and commute in because we have this super elitist policy of no roads.
Right. I don't want a 2.5 hour commute either. So it's a real sticky situation.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah.
By the way, I also wanted to say that, and I think I told you this already, but so I lived in North Dakota.
Yes.
And
Which I cannot I don't think that has ever happened in all of the time I've been in Oakland that I've had a professional conversation with someone and been like, wait, what?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I always famously said I'm the only VC that I've ever met that lived in North Dakota, but like you take, the crown because you grew up there effectively, so kudos to you.
Okay, so recently
but we are in a very small club.
we are in a teeny little club that is getting bigger. I was recently connected through someone I went to high school with to a social entrepreneur in North Dakota who is trying to connect the North Dakota diaspora, such as it is. And North Dakota evidently has the 49th largest sovereign wealth fund in the world as a result of all that oil and gas money in the Bakken. And they created a fund because they're such practical savers to kind of reap some of the profits of this that's now gigantic. And they
Wow.
are looking to create an innovation economy in North Dakota and fund entrepreneurs who are from there. And so I've been connected and I met like a super big wig VC here in the Valley who lived in North Dakota for the exact same 8 years that I did.
No way.
Crazy.
Whoa.
Yeah, who knew?
Club is growing.
I know, it's all coming together. The North Dakota takeover. Let's go, Joe.
What? Okay, let's get to your vast media career. Just you kind of started you started talking a little bit earlier about the AP.
Mm-hmm.
So my understanding is you've either worked at or written for New York Times, Wired, CNET, CBS. I mean, just like walk us through like your evolution in media and like kind of how that career kind of unfolded leading to today.
Yeah, it's very accidental that I guess I only ever worked for national brands. A friend of mine pointed that out to me. He's like, did you always set out to just only work for national brands? Which I did not. So yeah, I was lucky enough to get this AP job out of college, I think was sort of the origin of it. I went to college for creative writing, just wanted to be a writer. Quickly realized, type A, that I evidently am, that's not a job. It's a job for some people. For a lot of other people, it's just therapy. There was like a lot of crying in these classes. It was terrible. And then I met this really cool, and I also I think of myself as a creative, but I'm not a generator of stories exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have some well of stories inside me that I wanted to tell. And I met this cool woman who was the editor-in-chief of the daily newspaper. So the University of Montana has a daily newspaper, which is effectively a vo-tech school. It's phenomenal. And it is actually considered a really good journalism school as a result because you're doing the work. And so she was just so fascinating. And she kind of made me realize that you could do all of the same writing and storytelling, but that you got all the stories from other people. It's the greatest job ever. You just ask people, questions and get to know them and talk to them, and you write it down. And there is an endless, infinite reservoir of stories out there to tell. So I switched over to journalism, ended up becoming the editor-in-chief of that paper. And while I was in college, I covered the Unabomber arrest. This is my flashiest clip in life still. He was, because they found him in this cabin outside of Helena in the middle of nowhere, hiding out. And so there I am, college kid with a couple of photographers with like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, all these people in brand new boots and jackets standing in the winter, on top of this like mountaintop and saying, who are you with? And I'm like, the Montana Kaimin. We're the daily student newspaper of the, it's a Salish Kootenai word for messages. And then it was not uncommon, I think, for the AP to hire. The editor-in-chief job was a stepping stone into Associated Press. And that was, that's, once you have something like that on your resume, the AP is also like boot camp for journalism. It's just fast. You're just churning out content incredibly quickly. You're doing all kinds of sourcing, all kinds of reporting. I did some sports reporting. They sent me all over. And then I was in Omaha, my third post. So I went from Helena to Seattle.
Big city.
And from Seattle to Omaha with the Associated Press. Although I will say, Omaha, lovely town. I had a great experience there. Really good food, lots of great music, really friendly people. But then I got a call from a friend of mine from college who was like, hey, I'm back in Oakland. He lived in Oakland. And I need a roommate. What are you doing? I said, well, I'm in Omaha, so I'll be there in 30 days. It wore off pretty quickly. Packed up my truck, moved to Oakland, got a job in tech journalism. It's because if you moved to the Bay Area in 1999, no matter what you were doing, it was going to end up tech somehow. And so I got a job at a magazine that covered Apple and went to the Steve Jobs keynotes where he was unveiling the iPhone and the Bondi Blue iMac. And it was a really incredible time to have accidentally become a tech journalist. So I was at that magazine for about a year and a half, I think. By the end of it, I was writing the whole thing. So it was a whole other kind of boot camp in terms of tech journalism. And then I took a job at CNET because it was sort of the only online publication that I had come across that wasn't riddled with typos. It seemed like an actual professional operation. CBS bought us. And then I will always credit this CNET experience because I was just a trained print journalist. But CNET was kind of simultaneously covering the tech industry and helping to sort of invent big parts of the digital media industry as we know it today. Like we built a video portal contemporaneously with YouTube. Like we were briefly competitors. And it was one of the first online video portals alongside YouTube. I did the first commercially successful podcast on the web, like full stop. There was podcasting happening, but we started in 2005. It was really well sold. It had a big audience. We did every day for 6 years. We built, interface things like the river, right? The endlessly scrolling river. We were like among the earliest to do that. So there was this kind of wonderful combination of being an entrepreneur. Like I wrote a business plan for a 30-minute broadcast quality web show in 2013, I think we were doing this. We shot all over the world. And, I hired my own staff. And it was just a really cool experience that also taught me all these other forms of journalism, podcasting, video, TV. I did a ton of TV with CBS, that kind of thing. And then, anyway, yes, after I had done every job that CNET had, I finally left. I went to the New York Times for 15 months of cry every day. And then...
Why were you crying every day?
Oh, it's just the worst place ever.
Oh, why?
It's just not a... Let me just say that all the people who are leaving now because they want to own their own brand or they want to exist sort of separately from the New York Times or they want to actually do content that they think is valuable as opposed to what the Times thinks you should be doing, that was the experience I had there as well. Yeah. And then I went to Marketplace on NPR, although American Public Media is the parent company. No one knows this. It's not technically NPR. It's APM. And I had a wonderful 6 years there. But honestly, I started covering climate and climate solutions from that tech lens in 2017-ish, 2016, 2017. And it just became clear that I wanted the back half of my career to be about climate in some way, and that storytelling is incredibly valuable, and I will always respect it, but I don't have time to change minds. I needed to get boots on the ground. And I've known Jason a long time, and he came along at the right moment with this pitch to come on and do investing. And I said, well, okay, then I want to do climate investing, and I want to have This Week in Climate Startups on the This Week in Startups portfolio. And he was like, yeah, let's do it all. And about 3 months into my job, we had done it all.
Wow.
It's incredible.
That is incredible. So you talked about, what it was like at the New York Times.
I'm sorry.
No, it's amazing. I mean, it's a brilliant background. So, I have a couple of questions. So one is, I'll admit I'm a bit of a Luddite in terms of media, like behind the scenes of media. But I guess first off, like, what was that transition for you like from, being a journalist and writing and interviewing to becoming a personality on camera? Mm-hmm. Was that a tough transition, or did that feel like natural, like you were just where you needed to be?
It was weird, and I think it took me a while to take it seriously, if that makes sense, because this is going to sound, it's hard to say this because I feel awkward saying it. It did not seem very hard to me to be video talent or audio talent, which made me think this isn't very hard. I now understand, even though it's hard to say out loud, that is because I'm pretty good at that. But I think it took me a while to be able to acknowledge that and then start to expand into it and really try to own it and understand that this was really valuable. And like, yeah, there's a reason that CBS keeps calling or flying me out to be on the show. And then incorporate that in a serious way into my career. Even when I was having conversations about going to Marketplace, and they said, the job they had was to be Kai's backup, Kai Risdal, who hosts the show. And we kind of folded in, you'll also be a tech correspondent. I eventually ended up taking over the show called Marketplace Tech, and so hosted a national radio show on tech and business for a while. But my initial response to that was, well, that's absurd. I've never done radio. But I had done 6 years of daily podcasting, and I had been a guest on Marketplace and who knows what else radio for the intervening 15 years. Like, there was no reason that it was ridiculous, but it still took me a while to understand, like, I'm talent. And also, I specifically did not want to be talent, because that is a whole sort of separate road. So I feel like I spent a long time as a journalist trying to figure out how to be like talent and a producer, or talent and still a reporter, and not get rid of the thinking that sometimes comes from being talent or even be perceived as, I mean, literally there, we used to work with a guy who would come down the hall and go like, there's the talent. And I would just get furious because that's usually that's like a talking head, right?
So
that's somebody who doesn't do their own work.
In the media, that's a term.
Talent is a term.
Is kind of the person who just reads what's in front of them and doesn't do the actual reporting or investigation or thinking.
It can mean that. And I worked really hard not to have it mean that. It doesn't always, and it does a disservice, I think, to the people who, like Dan Rather, I think, was a great example. I have a friend who was his producer for a long time. And she was like, you have no idea how much reporting Dan Rather did and how much producing. But sometimes when you're the person who reads the news, you simultaneously are the one whose name is on the door that they blame for everything, even if you didn't do it. Or you're sort of perceived as just like sometimes people would write to me about Marketplace Tech and say, gosh, who writes the show? And I'm like, me. But I also learned the value of having an army of incredible producers who generate wonderful ideas. And so it's been a very interesting, like at some point I feel like I need to write some kind of a little memoir about what it is like to become talent, because it's a really different job than the one I started out doing as a journalist.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's really tough for me to wrap my head around, right? Because I've never had that experience, and the only media.
But now
really
you're talent, though.
But that's what I'm saying is like we're doing a podcast, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing this podcast for almost 5 years or 4 years, and it's just us talking, right? So it's not, and there's some prep, right, that happens, but I guess it would be different if someone was writing the questions for me. So I guess I get what you're saying. I don't know. Is it also like that in the podcasting world, or is podcasting like a different animal?
Podcasting used to be a different animal, but now a lot of podcasts do have producers. You could get one. It would not cheapen your brand at all, because some of the tension I experienced as talent was the ability to be produced and to have a producer whose job it is to make you the best you can possibly be. We have producers at This Week in Startups who help us find guests. They help us prepare, do research for them. They will give us like the summary of a book that we will also read. It makes your product better. And that in itself is also part of becoming talent, if you will, is understanding that support is in service of creating a product that delivers a lot of value, right? Like I guarantee that your show brings you deal flow. Ours does. And it cements you as a known quantity in an industry where that really, really matters. And so it's probably like you probably haven't spent a lot of time thinking about yourself as talent, but you are. And that is different. That's a different job from what you do as an investor.
Right. Okay.
You should totally get a producer, by the way. It really helps.
Maybe I will.
Yeah.
Let me ask you just one more question about media, which is to the layperson who's a consumer of media. I'll put myself in that category for the most part. What as an insider, what should we know about like sort of some of the inside baseball of like, how media actually works, or some of the like misconceptions people have about like media and how it's actually put together and produced?
This may surprise you, but like a lot of white guys are in charge. Media is there. I mean, the amount of like insider information about media that's boring, I guess, that my friends and I talk about all the time is probably not relevant. I think the thing to understand about media is that it's a business, and a lot of what you see in media is driven by the business incentives behind media. I loved being at public radio because the incentives were completely different from what they were. And I do not mean to imply that CNET or CBS has its moments of being a sellout, or the New York Times, are sellouts in any way, right? But they're advertising supported businesses. And I can remember times where I caused problems for CNET by writing snotty things about Apple that caused Apple to not want to advertise. And the only reason I was in Vancouver doing that shoot was to promote that CBS show. And the New York Times makes a lot of money selling the paper to subscribers of the actual newspaper, and also is fundamentally ad supported. And there is no universe in which being a business doesn't change your story selection. So it was really nice to get to Marketplace and be at a place where we were listener supported by incredibly smart people who wanted to be smarter. And so I sincerely felt, particularly on the heels of the New York Times experience, that my job at Marketplace was to be really smart and make other people smarter. And it was incredible. I loved it.
Do you think that's where media is heading? Or do
Public
you think,
supported?
Yeah.
I think that we are starting. I mean, it's interesting to see how many podcasts now exist on effectively the exact same model as public radio, right? Through Patreon and user donations. I think that Substack and the rise of independent journalism and subscriptions to individuals are really, really powerful and a very disruptive force, without a doubt. And there's so little trust in institutional media, and so many people saying, I seek out these independent sources, and I've got a lot of conflicting thoughts on that as well, right? Editors really matter. Like, expertise matters a lot. But I can't fault anybody who says I don't trust the incentives behind these big institutional media outlets, because they're businesses.
Different kind of question. What advice would you have for someone who's in media that is interested in venture and wants to get in, right? Because you're not the only example, right, of people starting in media and getting into venture.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing I love about venture is like you have so many different kinds of backgrounds and different styles where people can be successful. So
yeah,
what do you think?
I would say get yourself on the business desk and start thinking about your stories as business stories. So all the time I spent at CNET, I didn't realize I was becoming a business reporter, even though we were talking about business models, super early ones, right? I mean, I covered internet service providers, for God's sake. There used to be a lot of them. Now there's like 4, depending, They're all scattered throughout your individual regions. It was not until I got to the business desk of the New York Times and Marketplace that I really started to realize that what I was doing was business reporting. And that all the stuff that I had said about Facebook as a commentator was about targeted advertising as a business model. And that, things that I had thought about Apple and the way that, I would be like such a populist. I would be so angry at the way Apple treats its consumers and forces people to upgrade and this and that. And it hadn't made that mental switch to but that's an awesome business. Right? And that you may encounter, depending on the outlet that you're with, a resistance to thinking in those terms, when in fact, every story on earth is on some level a business story or a finance story. And I think that's a really valuable lens to put on as a journalist, no matter what, because follow the money has always been a really important journalistic creed. It also, I think, prepares your mind. VCs love to talk about the prepared mind for the kind of thinking that you'll have to do when you get into this business, and just make friends with them. I mean, honestly, I got VC curious because the first thing I did when I started hosting Marketplace Tech was do a big week-long series on venture capital, because I was like, this is so powerful. It's like this really black box. Nobody understands it. There's, all these companies that have been VC funded, and it's a networking business. So as a journalist, everybody will call you back. If you want to be a VC, start calling VCs.
Right. That's great advice. I wanted to shift a little bit to some of your kind of philosophies. And you mentioned earlier that you wanted to shift your career towards climate tech. Mm-hmm. And for the next however many years, what do you want to accomplish, let's say over the next however many years you define it?
Yeah.
And how will you know if you've been successful?
I will know that I've been successful. The most simplistic measure I can think of is that at the end, whenever that comes, if I actually ever retire, which I have a hard time imagining because I'm not Canadian. If I will have been successful if some of my baby turtles have made it to the sea, I mean, I want to build companies that last and are contributing solutions and creating jobs. My dad is so excited. He thinks I'm a job creator, which we are kind of. That's amazing.
100%.
I'll be curious about my gigaton score, but I hope that's not what I'm tracking. Like I think at going all the way back to the Gemini thing, I think I have a dual mandate in some ways because I came from media and we're still doing media. I want to build great companies. Like, yes, I am 100% committed to finding the Google of climate tech. Let's do that. And also, I want to be the Kara Swisher of climate tech, right? Like, I want to shift the conversation to solutions. I have no patience for your problem porn. I want to be ruthlessly focused on solutions. And I think of solutions much like the planet itself as an ecosystem. It would be very easy as an investor or just a person who sees the scale of this problem to be like distracted by the charismatic megafauna. Like, you can only pay attention. So do you know this?
I do know this term.
Yes. And do you know these books, the Expanse series? It's a show on Amazon Prime.
I know of it. I haven't followed it closely.
All right. So a big part of the reason I'm a climate investor is because of sci-fi.
Okay.
Yes, I'm a big sci-fi nerd. And there's this great super teeny chunk in one of the many, many books in this Expanse series where this father is talking to his daughter and it's sort of in the future, right? And he's saying, oh, you tried to build this simulated ecosystem and it failed because you got obsessed with charismatic megafauna and you put in like big, mature, beautiful trees and jaguars and elephants. But if you want to build an ecosystem, you have to have bacteria and bugs and seeds, and you have to have a layer of foundation on which an ecosystem can be built. And that ecosystem is encompassing of a ton of different things that some are not sexy, and some don't seem necessary, and they all have to exist. So what I would love to say is that I funded and told stories about a lot of bugs and bacteria.
What science fiction is most pertinent in your journey that made you care about climate tech?
There was a little passage in, it's kind of one of those where I grew, I think we're of a similar age maybe. And It's like the climate crisis was always there. We were talking about the hole in the ozone. It had become this like drumbeat in the back of my head that was really hard to ignore. And two things happened at the same time. One, I was reading Kim Stanley Robinson is this sometimes called cli-fi author. And he's been writing for decades. He's written a ton of books. He wrote this Mars trilogy that really actually is an ecological story. But he increasingly has gotten more and more explicit as a writer about climate change. He wrote this book, Ministry for the Future, that everybody's reading right now that's almost like a manual for how to deal with climate change. You should totally read it. But he wrote this book called New York 2140 that takes place in 2140 in New York City after the city has experienced two successive 50-foot sea level rises. And it still is like the center of global finance. It's kind of this weird book about climate change and global finance. And he has this kind of throwaway line in the book about how the buildings in downtown Manhattan, lower Manhattan, are coated with this diamond coating to keep the water out so that they can just keep living in them and still doing business. And it just sort of stuck with me. And then I was having a conversation with my hairdresser, who also cuts the hair of this world-famous climate scientist, Inez Fung, who works at Berkeley, Cal. And she was saying that we had really reached a tipping point. This was many years, long before she wrote this in the most recent IPCC report. Or I think she's not writing them anymore because she has turned her career toward this question of what comes next. Because we really, as we now know, are not going to be able to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Like, there's a level of warming that's baked in that's, even as you and I are talking, wreaking havoc in South Carolina after destroying huge chunks of Florida. And she made this sort of comment that it was an engineering problem now. And somehow those two pieces of information just came together in my brain and made me go, this is my story. Like, finally, I can cover this from a tech perspective. And I actually started looking into it as an adaptation and resilience story. I called the series How We Survive, which is really on the nose. Like, okay, well, if all this is going to happen, what is the version? Who's building the diamond coating for the buildings?
I would say the piece that that really resonates with what you're saying is this I've never heard this term, but the problem porn.
I think I made it up.
Did you make it up?
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. It's my favorite thing about these podcasts is like when I learn a phrase.
Let's just make it a thing.
Yeah.
Hashtag problem porn. I don't want to hear it.
Seriously, because I always get so annoyed with, all these, climate focused people, whether or not they're investors or not. It's like, if we don't do anything in the next, 6 months, like we're all, and I'm just like, okay, we've heard that for so many years. And I actually feel like it's counterproductive because when people hear that, they think, well, I've been hearing that for 5 years and, I haven't seen that happen or like, how can you prove it? Like, I like to flip it, totally the opposite direction, which is, hey, we have a huge opportunity here to create an entirely new industry that can be U.S. centered, American made, U.S. manufacturing, and the investment opportunity of a lifetime. I mean, some people are calling climate tech like a $100 trillion market. I mean, that to me is way more compelling than, hey, we're all going to die and, we need to do something about it, but I can't tell you when or how or like.
And I will reject any solution you bring me if it's not sufficiently like pure or perfect or cool enough. Like, I think I'm seeing it in VC already. And I think I've been a little guilty of it. Like, I came in very starry-eyed, like, I just want to fund real stuff and hard tech and this and, when in fact, some of that is charismatic megafauna, right? Measurement and metrics and databases and dashboards, those are bugs and bacteria. Those have to exist.
Right.
And that there can't be this sort of like purity test for what is or is not climate investing, because the truth is we don't know what's going to work. I'm at the early stage. It's a lot of baby turtles. We got to try everything.
To support that, you just looking at recent history, what unlocked the solar industry? It was finance. It was an innovation in fintech and a business model.
Yeah.
So I totally agree on that point. And that's a perfect example from my perspective on like the bacteria. It's like, oh, this little tweak of how do we finance these solar, and then all of a sudden it's everywhere.
Yeah.
What's something you believe that other people don't? What's your most contrarian opinion?
I don't think pandas are real. I mean, I'll get to a serious answer first, but I legitimately am not 100% convinced that pandas are real. They're too cute.
Have you seen them in person?
I mean, I've either seen extremely advanced animatronics projects or little dudes in panda suits, because there is no way that cuteness is a real thing.
Okay. It's good to be skeptical.
Do your own research on the panda question. I think that as of late, I'm thinking a lot about, this isn't even that tricky, I don't think. I don't know. When I think about the society and the culture, I think we may need to figure out how to separate as we look at finance and financing and investing. I can't believe I'm going to say it. I think we might need to figure out how to separate the E from the S and G.
Ooh, say more.
We have somehow, we need to do social and governance. We need to do climate. We will not solve social and governance before we solve climate. And if we make that our blocker to solutions, we won't get them done.
We won't solve S and G.
Like, we're not going to maybe take the G out. We will not solve environmental racism in the time we need to tackle the climate problem. And I am worried that we may find ourselves in situations where we say we can't fund this climate solution because it doesn't address environmental racism. And that may mean that we don't address climate, and that will cause people who are already suffering from climate change to suffer more.
Do you have an example in mind? Because I'm not sure I've ever run into that paradox.
It's more like, I'm trying to think of an example where a solution hasn't moved forward. Well, I mean, I think interestingly, it came up with the Green New Deal, which is part of what turned this into a culture war in some ways. And I don't know how we get out of that. I'm certainly not saying that we need to not deal with the effects of environmental racism and that environmental justice needs to be a part of our policy, it can't stop our funding, if that makes sense. Like, we can't say, this doesn't have enough justice in it, this solution, when the solution has to apply to the entire planet. And so therefore we can't do it.
I just haven't run into that situation, I don't think. Maybe you have.
I mean, I think that's what Republicans are hanging their sword on right now. Is like, this is about culture, so we can't address it.
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're saying people who reject the S side of it for political reasons will also reject the E. Okay.
That there's a degree to which, like, there are millions of people in this country and across the world. I mean, literally, like, did Putin bring it up today? No, that was something else. Who reject the entire concept. Like, it's a blocker.
I see.
For talking about climate. Because it's become a culture war issue. Now, that is terrible and unacceptable. But the question is, how do we respond to that by tying these two things even more together? Or do we say climate is a crisis that addresses that affects everyone? Full stop, right? Unequally, without a doubt. But full stop, everyone.
I get it. I get what you're saying. Because you have seen some states say, hey, we don't like ESG. Right? And so anything that is ESG related, we're not interested in.
We won't do.
And you're saying that sometimes gets attached to anything climate tech related. And so you're saying you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And if that is a controversial thing, which it is, and so you're trying to decouple those. Is that fair? Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting point of view. I get why you're saying that. I guess I tend to try to decouple them in my mind anyway, like from the get-go, which is like, for example, we're investing in climate tech, health, inclusive capitalism, and then we also have like an ESG lens that we look at all of those opportunities with.
Yeah.
So I always say they're interrelated, but they're not congruent. So, but yeah, what you bring up is an interesting point. I have to think more about it. But I also try to take the political side of things as much as I can to the side and decouple that from the business side of things.
Right.
Now, sometimes you can't do that.
Right.
But part of my personal philosophy around regulations, and I might have told you this, is I like to invest in companies that have regulatory tailwinds, like our co-investment that shall not be named. Whereas the business can stand alone without the regulatory involvement, but any regulation that comes on board is going to be additive.
Absolutely.
Right? As opposed to, I think what happened a lot 10 years ago where people were saying, oh, this new regulation's coming. And now we can build a business that we otherwise couldn't because of this subsidy or because of this thing. And then lo and behold, that regulation gets turned off. Right. And then you have no business. So anyway, but I appreciate you taking a controversial viewpoint.
Exactly. Is this my like personal philosophy that I'm going to die on? No. But it's something that I have been kind of noticing more and more and thinking, and there's this kind of perception that I'm like a hippie investor who wants to lose money, or that there's certain things that I maybe wouldn't be able to invest in because the ultimate goal is to, help underrepresented communities. Obviously, my air pollution investment, one of the reasons I love it is for exactly that reason. But I also am very familiar that I came from states where people are like, I'm rolling coal until I die. Philosophically. And and I mean, literally, like my mom sent me an ad for a candidate in North Dakota who's like, I'm pro-family, I'm pro-life, and I'm pro-life, pro-gun, and pro-coal. Pro-coal. Like, I don't. And so it's this sort of thing where I don't also want to be the person who's sitting here and saying like, we got to get rid of social justice so that we can fix this problem because that lady's not going to come around. That lady should come around.
Yeah.
Social justice should happen. And addressing the climate crisis from a perspective, like a ruthless focus on solutions also should happen. And I think in my mind starting to play with like, how do I triangulate those things?
Yeah. My view on this is I don't want to fall into that narrative trap, right?
Maybe that's what it is.
Of saying, oh, there's a contradiction, there's a trade-off. I like to focus on, let me show you some real world examples where it's a win-win-win. It's
Totally.
a win for the customers, it's a win for the investors, it's a win for the environment and, the communities that they exist in. And for people who say, well, no, I'm not interested in any of that climate tech stuff because I'm not willing to turn off my air conditioning when it's hot out. And I'm like, I don't want to turn off my air conditioning. I don't have air conditioning, but I don't want to turn off my fans or my air conditioning when it's hot out either. And I think if you're asking people to do that, that's the wrong equation. You've got to show someone, here's a technical solution that's going to be good for you.
Right.
It's going to help the company and it's better for everybody. And so I think part of our job as climate tech investors is illuminating that for people.
I think that's also true, 100%. I mean, people talk about the Mr. Burns test,
What's this?
It's the can you make a solution that's good enough and cheap enough that Mr. Burns would buy it, even if he fundamentally, even if he thinks that the reasoning behind it is like it is ridiculous, or he was gonna roll coal forever, but then heat pumps came along and they're so much better and cheaper. And there's a really strong argument to be made there too, which is that if you create the products that are just better. I mean, I am a lifelong car girl. I love cars. I even love really big, stupid trucks, like a lot. But once you drive an electric car and you're a car person, you're like, I'm sorry. I didn't know I had infinite torque to work with here. Like, this is better.
Right.
It's a better experience.
Right. Exactly.
So there's that too. So this is a contrarian line of thinking, but not a contrarian philosophy. It's more like it's a thing I think we're going to have to, I think we're going to have to address it more and more. It's a barrier to regulation, 100%, right? Like, I can't believe we find ourselves in a scenario where across the world, not just in the United States, but certainly in the United States, it's like, oh, if the Republicans retake Congress, they will undo climate legislation because they think it's woke. We cannot pretend that that's not a real thing, and we do have to figure out how to deal with it. Otherwise, all those tailwinds never exist.
For any Gen Zs that are listening, Mr. Burns was a character on this show called Simpsons.
They're not listening anymore because of everything I just said, but also, The Simpsons is still on.
I know, but it's...
yeah, no, that was an old reference.
No, it's good. Actually, just like 2 days ago, I was texting with a friend and I made a mistake with my calendar and I had to reschedule. And he wrote "dough," like the Homer Simpson. I was like, oh yeah, we're the same generation. That's awesome.
My son is 15. He's rewatching The Simpsons.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
The kids are going to be okay.
All right.
Yep.
That's encouraging.
Yeah.
That gives me faith. What would you say is like one transformative experience from your life that kind of changed the arc of whether it's your career or your like kind of personal views?
Other than my hairdresser? Yeah. Honestly, it's kind of a big one. I mean, actually, no question. It's a really simple one. It's when I moved to Oakland. And it's funny because I moved here to live with this friend who had been my first love in college, and we had stayed friends. So I moved out here. He introduced me to my then husband. That's why I have a baby, He also, who's 15, right now is like, not cool, Mom. He also got me the job at the Mac magazine because he was working there as an IT guy. And a few years back, I actually sent him an email that was like, hey, buddy, thanks for my whole life. Like you never know what person is going to be the kind of the pivotal hinge event that changes everything. I don't know where I would have ended up because I was with the AP and they sent me to different cities. And I don't know that I would have gone back to Montana or North Dakota. Like I had more ambition than that. But I would not be sitting here Like that is a multiverse moment that set me on a completely different course. And it was just that one phone call.
And
I'm back in Oakland and I need a roommate.
and it was a pretty like instant decision, right?
Oh,
for
yeah.
you? Yeah.
Yeah. By the time I had hung, I was like, okay, I'm in. Give me a month.
I love it.
Yeah.
Last question for you would be, what
Pandas are not real.
Besides pandas are not real. What? How do you know pandas are not?
I'm never coming out of this. I hate Canadians. Pandas are not real. Climate investing is too woke. Like I am going to hell. I'm going to walk out of here into hell. What is wrong with me?
I love it. I don't think I've laughed this hard on a podcast so far.
You're laughing. I'm over.
You're too big to be over. If you could go back in time and give yourself some advice that you would have liked to have heard or would have been valuable for you to have heard earlier in life, what would that be?
Man, I think about this a lot actually because I feel so lucky. I think it would be a couple things. The positive version is like a lot of times I say to myself that I wish I could go back to my 14-year-old self who was just so lost and unhappy and had such a bad haircut and be like, don't do that haircut. But also, I wish I could just go back and say, like, you are not going to believe what happens. Like, you're not going to believe how great it gets. So just hang in there. It's going to be all right. I'm like literally like weepy because it's really true. And then I would also say, please value yourself more. Like you don't have to. You don't have to. I would just be like, love yourself. Just have the faith, and your position is valid. I guess is a way to put that.
Do you feel like you didn't feel that way when you were younger?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all go through some version of that, right? Like you marry the wrong person, or you take the wrong job because you feel like it's the thing you're supposed to do. You know, that your convictions are worth having courage around. Like that, what you feel in your gut is true. Yeah.
That's the positive version.
No, that's the bummer version.
Oh, that's the bummer version.
The positive version is just to go back and be like, girl, we're going to have a Barbie dream house.
You got this.
Like, it's going to be amazing.
I see. I see. Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Oh my God. I'm like, this is like, you really get there.
Do you cry on every podcast?
Yeah, I'm a weeper.
Are you really?
I'm a straight up crier. Yeah, everyone knows this actually. Like, crier.
I appreciate it.
Music, commercials, those cheesy like AT&T ads. Like if the dad is dancing with the girl and then whatever, I'm done. I'm a mess.
I know what you mean. I get some of that too. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for coming and just being so candid and yourself. I really just appreciate it. How can everyone follow you, keep track of you going forward, and get in touch?
You can yell at me on Twitter about everything I've said on the show at Mollywood. Molly@launch.co is my email address if you are a company and you want to get in touch. And also the Climate Syndicate can be found at thesyndicate.com/climate. Companies would be investors. If you're an accredited investor and you want to join the syndicate and read our deal memos, thesyndicate.com/climate is where to find me.
Awesome.
And This Week in Startups, 6 days a week.
6 days a week. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here, and we'll look forward to following up.
This is awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.